Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. With me today on Writers at Work is Catherine Conybeare, author and academic who is widely acknowledged as an authority on Augustine of Hippo, known to many as St. Augustine. Catherine's new book is Augustine the African, which considers him in the context of his African heritage. He was born in Thagaste, a city in present-day Algeria in North Africa. After about 5 years in Milan and Rome, agitated years according to the author, and following the death of his mother and son, he returned to the family home and in his mid-30s was ordained in Hippo, also in present-day Algeria. That remained his base until his death at age 75. Catherine is the Lesley Clark Professor in the Humanities and Professor of Greek, Latin, and Classical Studies at Bryn Mawr. Her research centers on late antiquity, especially the writings of St. Augustine. She's the author of 4 previous books, including The Irrational Augustine, and more than 80 articles and reviews. As a lay reader, I found Augustine the African to be a marvel. One of the reasons is the quality of the prose. Though it is fortified with evidence that supports her conclusion, the story is never overburdened with gratuitous detail, and it flows beautifully. What comes across is her delight in having discovered a new way to look at a man she describes as one of the most influential writers and thinkers in the history of humankind. It's my great pleasure to say, Catherine Conybeare, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you so much.
Catherine, this may sound like a trick question, but I don't mean it as such. Who is your ideal reader for Augustine the African?
My ideal reader is someone who picks up the book and is curious about why the map on the cover is flipped. So anyone who is open to thinking differently about the world.
You know, I ask because I found your book so engaging. For me, it had the flow of fiction or speculative nonfiction, but in fact, it's neither. Tell me about your approach to writing this particular book.
Yes, I hope it isn't speculative nonfiction, though there are certainly some patches where I've had to use my imagination, but it is in fact located very firmly in the primary sources, above all in Augustine's own writings, which are abundant, as you would have learned from the book. 5 million surviving words. That's an extraordinary legacy to work with. And my process was to immerse very deeply in those writings. I was always reading them in Latin, so I felt I was as close to Augustine as I could reasonably be. And through that and through the tiny details of his writings to get a sense of the texture of his life. And from that emerged the narrative, perhaps indeed novelistic, that I've tried to develop in this book.
Yeah. I think you balance your responsibilities as an academic and what I'd call indulging your sense of wonder. And what I mean is the writing is infused with delight. And I suspect that comes from what you describe so vividly in your prologue. You describe, quote, walking through the silent ruins of Augustine's city, close quote, looking toward Italy and having something of an awakening about his ambivalence toward Rome's dominance. Can you tell us about that experience, that moment for you?
Absolutely. By that time, I was already immersed in the book in as much as I'd read a great deal of Augustinian material, and I hadn't yet found the key to rereading it, as it were. So there was a risk, having set up the importance of Africa for Augustine and his point of view on the world, that I would then just read particularly the better known works, the Confessions, the City of God, exactly the same way as all my predecessors. And it was in that moment, in the beautiful, deserted ruins of Hippo, that I realized that it was all about point of view, that it was all about where he was looking at the world from, where he was encountering the Mediterranean, the coastline, the views. It made all the difference in the world that the Mediterranean was to his north and not to his south, and that Rome was to his north and not on the peninsula on which he lived.
Now, was this like a thunderbolt moment, or was it ticklish with delight? I mean, what was your physical reaction to this realization?
The whole trip to Algeria was filled with delight. It was so fascinating, finally, to be walking in these places that Augustine had walked. So no, it wasn't a bolt from the blue. It was, yes, delight, a delightful warmth of realization spreading through me, I think it would be fair to say.
Yeah. That is a wonderful moment, though, for a writer, isn't it?
Yes, it absolutely is. The moment when you see the freshness, you experience that deep freshness to what you're doing, even with someone like Augustine, who has been worked and reworked through time.
So when you were reassessing his after this epiphanous moment, when you were reassessing his writing, now through the prism of his African heritage, did you chide yourself for not having seen it sooner?
No, I didn't, because it's complicated and delicate. I saw the significance of Africa for him very early on in my work. And by that, I mean 25 years ago, reading works of Augustine for a quite different book. I noticed that little passage that I mention where his students in Rome laugh at him for his African accent. And of course, it was probably the first time that he had realized that he had an African accent. But working on the book was a matter of joining up the handful of well-known places where he does allude to his domicile in Africa, or where other people allude to it for him, favorably or not so much. Joining up that, of realizing if his African identity comes to the forefront in these particular moments, he has to have been aware of it all the time. It has to have inflected his writing. And often it's so subtle that you can't trace it. But sometimes, and I would say it's most prominent perhaps in my rereading of The City of God, it really enables on his part a quite new perspective on a conventional narrative. And hence that view enabled my new perspective on a conventional narrative.
Do you write while you're researching, or do you do your research and then write?
The latter.
You do the latter.
It's really important to me to have a sense of the full arc before I start writing. That doesn't mean I didn't fill in some gaps once I had material written. And also, the odd thing about this book, which I think speaks to the effort it took to flip the narrative, to turn Augustine's conventional reading on its head, was I started writing each chapter thinking I knew what the most important point was. And as I developed the chapter, I realized that though that was important, there was something else that was even more significant. So the writing process was also incredibly important in honing my ideas, refining what I wanted to say, and refining this new angle.
Yeah. You describe Augustine as profoundly human, passionate and complicated, prickly and vulnerable, brilliant and striving, and loyal to loved ones. That is one hell of a protagonist, Catherine. I mean, what can you do with this? I mean, he's boundless, really.
Yes.
You have
Well,
sort of have to rein him in a bit,
he
right?
he is boundless, of course, so prolific, and he does indeed contain multitudes. One of the things I had to make myself do, because this is nonfiction, not creative nonfiction,
Correct, correct.
was sit with the deep contradictions in his character and in the ways in which he encountered the world. And I think that's perhaps summed up best from that description in the prickly and vulnerable pairing. His vulnerability is part of what makes him a pleasure to spend so much time with, because he is so emotionally honest so much of the time. Of course, a lot of people know that through his confessions, but it spreads elsewhere as well. At the same time, that prickliness sometimes makes him lash out. And one of the main ways I had to sit with the contradictions of his personality was in his behavior to the African church, in the increasing brutality that he helped to mobilize in order to suppress what he saw as a schismatic and damaging church. And that was obviously very complicated for a vision of Augustine as an African.
Yeah, there's a section of the book. Let me just pull up my notes for a second here. Um, in fact, you have the precise date of August 10th, 412, when there is a vigilante lynching of a customs officer, a corrupt customs officer. And you quote him directly, but you ask us to imagine his quiet, strained voice penetrating through the church with the nervous, guilty people standing below him, tightly packed together in the heat. Um, he really gives them a very hard time, doesn't he?
Yes, he
There's
does.
no, I don't get a sense of Christian forgiveness there.
I don't think he thinks that forgiveness is merited at that moment. Yes, he gives them a very hard time. He preaches for a good half an hour before he gets to the point that everyone is waiting for. And they are, one would infer from his words, because we don't, of course, have their reactions, they are waiting to be let off the hook, to be told, it's all right, you weren't responsible for this lynching. And he says exactly the opposite. He says, it's not enough to say, I didn't do it. If you didn't stop it, you're responsible. And I think that's an extraordinarily powerful message of
Indeed.
civic duty one to another.
So, did your feelings about him change? I imagine that having written about him often and before, you had a certain emotional reaction. You had your own personal Augustine, and now you have all this new information and new perspective. Did your feelings about him change?
I do have a new personal Augustine. I actually became fonder of him, even as I saw him as more flawed. I mean, he is at this point such a real person to me. If he walked in and sat down in a chair and started lecturing me about something, I would be delighted. But would also feel that he was familiar.
Did that influence the writing? At some point, did you feel, um, and I'm talking now not about I'm talking about the quality of the writing. At some point did you say to yourself, no, I need to convey this through um, through the quality of the emotion of the prose, or something along those lines.
I hope it made the writing more vivid. Um, I should give a big shout out to my editor, Bob Weil, who pressed me again and again on just these moments. He would say, I can tell you're feeling something, but it's not coming through. The death of his mother is a good example. He made me rewrite that death. He said I passed over it too casually, and really to dwell in that emotion. Because, of course, emotion isn't conveyed, as I have learned, by saying, this was very sad.
Yes.
Conveyed by feeling very sad and writing from that emotional position. And again, I learned so much about writing in writing and rewriting this book and in working with Bob. I learned so much about letting that emotion happen and realizing it wasn't distorting the data, it was enhancing the material I was working with.
I have a sense that um, that emotional position, that writing from that made you think more vividly, and to provide the reader with the capacity to share your emotion. And I'd like to. This is going to take me a minute to read this. I hope you don't mind, but it's about how you handle backstory or forward story, I guess it would be. Um, and this is one of my favorite parts of the book. You describe for us a site, Annaba, which is now present-day Hippo. The remains of the basilica there are said to be associated with Augustine, but you point out it may not be so. Then you vividly describe a tiny museum, its striking mosaics, then a 19th century church in which a bone from Augustine's right forearm is set behind glass. You also describe three priests who tend to the remaining Christians in the region who must pass through a police checkpoint to attend Mass. And then the next paragraph begins with, back in 391. That's really treacherous territory for a writer, that kind of veering from the thrust of the narrative.
Mm.
But and you see it all the time, that people will find something delicious and indulge in it and go far away from where they're supposed to be. But I should point out that all that I just described, you do in just 2 paragraphs. So you mentioned Bob. How conscious were you about keeping to the point of things?
My flaw in writing is too much point and not enough ambience. So, in other words, my first draft of anything tends to be very pared down and very direct and very clearly structured. So, actually, the more expansive passages are the ones that Bob encouraged me to develop. So the through line was already there.
Yeah.
And the description I tried very carefully to integrate. But I do, as you can probably see, express myself concisely to a fault. There's
I'm going to disagree with you, because I find it remarkable that you just said that, because I couldn't disagree more strongly. And I want to say to the writers who are eavesdropping on our conversation that one way that you keep your forward story brief is by the use of vivid, memorable language. You show us, for example, the mosaics. I'm quoting you now. The mosaics are a restrained scheme of ochre, terracotta, and cloud gray. That the tiny museum sits on a mound above the ancient ruins surrounded by gravestones. Those three priests I mentioned live in a simple yellow stucco annex tucked to one side of the church. But you said that kind of writing isn't instinctive to you.
Once I'm told to do it, it's instinctive.
Okay.
You see what I mean?
Yes, yes,
And in
absolutely.
a way, it's part of the training to move beyond academic prose. And
Yeah.
that was what Bob, bless his heart, was training me to do in this book.
Yeah.
I wrote a very good academic book that I thought was for a more popular audience. And Bob made me completely rewrite it. And what he did was prise it open to make space just for these moments of observation. So the moments were there, they were in my mind. I just had to be told it was okay to do that.
Yeah. Uh, when did you write the prologue?
At the very end.
Because the prologue is really it it's all there. It's all there. And I must confess I feared a certain dry academic experience when I picked up the book, but I would say I was not even a third of the way through the prologue when I realized, oh, this is going to be a pleasure.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes, I wrote the prologue at the end. Well, I wrote the prologue several times. But I think I did three different drafts after I'd finished writing the rest of the book. Um, and this time actually, it got more and more concise. And yet at the same time more expansive, if that makes sense. It was more thematically expansive. It was more concisely expressed. And in the end, I was very happy with it. It was a most peculiar writing experience because in the drafts, I knew I was missing the mark. And I didn't necessarily know how. And this time, I didn't work with what I had. I started completely from scratch each time. And finally, I wrote the one that you read and
Mm,
said, yes, that's it, done.
yeah. The lesson there, I think, for writers is that you can save real estate by being deep in your concise writing. That you can do something very briefly if it's vivid and resonates emotionally with the reader. And I think that you did that so well in this book, Catherine. Um, so I asked you earlier about your notes. I think do you take detailed notes? And what I mean by I don't mean fact-filled notes. I mean notes filled with descriptive language.
On experiences or on the books I'm reading?
Uh, on experiences. For example, when you visit a site, what do your notes look like? Are they little sketches? Are they florid language? What's your notebook look like when you have been someplace?
I'm afraid they're largely non-existent.
Oh my.
I take a couple of photos. I'm a terrible photographer, so that's not necessarily um, a good guideline. I found these moments that I was being pressed to describe that little yellow stucco house, or for example, at the end, walking through Pavia. I I relied very strongly on memory. So it may be impressionistic, but I felt what stuck with me was probably what would be striking to the reader.
Right, but you augment your photographs with your memories.
Yes.
Yeah, I described this reaction I had. I was doing a story set in 17th century Rome, and I had countless photos of the Vatican, countless photos of St. Peter's, and so now it was time for me to go, and I went, and I was walking up the steps, and I realized that you could smell the Tiber from those steps, and that you could hear the seagulls.
Yes.
And so we I think we need to be there. I do
So
think that.
that was it. Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. I will say the other thing that has formed my trust in memory, I've done a certain amount of work over the years with manuscripts. And you go and you visit a manuscript and you read it and you look for the paratextual marks and you think about it. And then you go away. And of course, these days, manuscripts are digitized. This is less of a problem. But 20 years ago, not the case. You would go away, I would go away, and realize as I started to write up my findings, the thing I was most interested in, I hadn't even taken notes on. Every time. It was extraordinary. So I think the visits to sites are a bit like that too. But yeah, you have to be there
Yeah.
in ways I hadn't realized until relatively recently.
Yeah. So I want to mention that that 19th century French church that I mentioned a few minutes ago, it has a life-size image of Augustine. But as you tell us, we don't know what he looks like.
Exactly.
So I don't know how there could be a life-size image, but what does he look like to you in your mind?
Ah, very distinct, as you might expect from my comment earlier about him walking in. He is small. He is brown. He is bald. He has black, piercing eyes. And he both listens and speaks with extraordinary intensity.
When we think I'm thinking of the sort of Hollywood version of Jesus,
Mhm.
um, who could not possibly have looked like that during his time and place. Um, but for example, we knew that Jesus apprenticed as a carpenter,
Yes.
so we can imagine some strength in his arms and some calluses on his hands and some little scars from flying pieces of wood and whatnot. Um, this is sort of, I mean, what did Augustine do when he wasn't studying, learning, preaching? I mean, was his entire life a life of the mind?
That's an excellent question. If he did much else, he leaves us very little trace of it. I think, like any Roman, he walked through the streets, he went to the baths, he talked with his friends. But his life really does seem to have been predominantly one of thinking, reading, writing, talking, teaching to an extraordinary degree. And particularly in the last 20 years of his life, he produced a prodigious amount of material. And though he probably wasn't writing it himself, he was dictating, it still suggests a level of activity that would have meant he was thinking about what he was working on pretty much all the time. He had to, as a bishop, he had certain responsibilities as a bishop, but they were all under the umbrella of the teaching, speaking, judging. He would have bishops served as judges as well, though he leaves us no trace of that in his work.
Yeah. I find interesting your description of him as we're speaking because you do not use that in the book. But you and in fact I have written this in my notes. I don't know what he looks like,
Yeah.
but I can see him. And what I see is that intensity that you have given physical traits to, but that's your own thing. That's your that you don't impose that on the reader.
Exactly. And I'm thrilled that you felt the intensity. That's exactly what I wanted. And it was also a very conscious decision not to describe him in the book because I wanted space for people to find their own Augustine in terms of what he looked like. In the course of working on this book, I discovered that a Black Augustine is incredibly important to African American Catholics. Many parishes are called after Augustine or his mother Monica. And I really wanted them to be space, there to be space for them to see their Augustine in this book.
Yeah.
I don't
I
know
was
what he looked like.
no, I was searching for photos of Algerians prior to the arrival of the French.
Uh-huh.
I wanted to get a sense of what Algerians looked like prior to the mid 19th century, and we can't find them. But I wonder if, as you may know, or we're reassessing Mary Magdalene now.
Mhm.
We have a different context for her, and we see her what's written about her through different lens. I'm trying to think of my childhood being raised as a Catholic and what I thought of Saint Augustine. I don't have a clear memory of him. I don't think he was a primary um, person for us, certainly in elementary school.
Uh-huh.
We did not, I think he may have just been too daunting
Yes.
in many ways. Um, what is the contemporary view of Saint Augustine?
I think it depends on to whom you speak. Um, but for most people who know about him, the contact point is the confessions. They read the confessions, they are transported that a fourth century bishop would talk in this way about himself and his life. They tend to ignore the fact that the whole confessions is a prayer and the fact that it's also very much a philosophical work. Um, and the trouble with that view is it leaves the vast majority of Augustine's life and his influence unaccounted for. Most of his writings, and certainly the ones that theologians down the centuries seized on, post-date the confessions.
Mm.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, I'm trying to um, as a lay reader coming to your book, a
Mm.
couple of times I thought to myself, oh, I wonder if this conclusion or inference will be challenged
Mhm.
by people who have a more traditional view. And will there be now a dialogue, much as we've seen with Mary Magdalene, that there's now a reassessment, and I think the reassessors have kind of have the platform now. Um, I mean, have you been challenged on your conclusions by people who may view things differently than you do?
Not yet. It's only been out for a couple of months. Um, I would say the one review so far that has registered disappointment um, was clearly looking for unrelieved African uplift. And as I've said already, the picture is actually extremely complicated, and you have to read the whole book to see that, his African identity was important, but it was important in different ways. So it's not a soundbite book for all that we've talked about the fact that
Yes,
it's quite
yes.
concise. You don't come away saying, "Ah, now I see a glorious vision of Africa was at the heart of the whole of Augustine's thought." That's not true. Um, but
I,
no,
I
I haven't had, to degrees that surprise me, actually. I haven't yet had real pushback.
huh. My take of what you show his relationship with Africa to be is home.
Yes.
You know, this is um it's not it is actually a real thing. It's not a thought of a thing. It's home.
Exactly. Thank you. And as home is, it's a very textured thing. And it's not necessarily, and part of the book, as you know, is about this, it's not necessarily a place in which one feels at home, paradoxically.
Correct.
Yeah.
So listen, what are you working on now?
I am working on a new translation of the Confessions for Norton as well. You may ask, do we really need another translation of the Confessions? And my answer, and happily Norton's answer too, is yes, because I feel that there is no translation out there that captures two fundamental things about the confession. One is that it was written to be heard, not to be read off the page. So the sound of the language is incredibly important. And the other thing is, I don't know of a translation, though there are some very good ones out there, that captures the range of stylistic registers across which Augustine writes. So he can be very high flown, he can be very technical, he can sound like the Psalms, he can be very colloquial. All of these are encompassed in the Confessions, and I am striving to produce a translation that captures that range of registers and that has a beauty, or again, actually, the word is intensity, of oral impact that parallels the original Latin.
What do you think is the key component of his oration? Is it rhythm? Is it language? Is it manipulation of the audience's attention? What do you find, and what do you want to convey?
So when you say oration, do you mean his sermons, or are you referring to the Confessions again?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought the confessions were at some point spoken.
They, who knows?
Yeah,
My contention is very much that they may or may not have been dictated, but that he expected people to read them aloud.
I see.
Interestingly, you ask about prose rhythm, and in the Confessions, he completely eschews the prose rhythms that he had learned as a classically trained orator.
Wow.
There's a handful of places, particularly early on when he's talking about his education, where he ends a sentence with an identifiable classical prose clausula. But in general, and it has to be intentional, he completely avoids those regular rhythmical closings. He breaks all sorts of rules. He breaks rules of syntax too, in the way he presents his thoughts. He breaks rules of word order. He ends sentences with a preposition. Again, sorry, not a preposition, a pronoun, again and again. That's truly peculiar in classical Latin. It literally almost never happens. So there's something defiant and mold breaking going on right from the beginning of the Confessions. His classical clausulae, I think, are because as he narrates his own life, he does a remarkable job of recreating his own view of the world at different stages. So his child's eye view, his adolescent's eye view. So as a child, when the Aeneid is being drummed into him, then of course he just occasionally slips into that rhythm, but he eschews it completely for the vast majority of the work.
There's lessons there for writers.
Yes.
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 Listen, my guest today is Catherine Conybeare, whose latest book is Augustine the African, which I love for so many reasons, not the least of which is the quality of the prose. Catherine, thank you so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
Jim, thank you so much. This has been a joy.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersaTworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.